Hey there, welcome back. Hope everyone had a good week. Last week we talked about the harmonic aspects of the phrase. Um, this week I want to start with melodic aspects of the phrase, and then sort of towards the end, talk about how they come together to make longer segments of music. As I mentioned last week, the shortest structural segment of music is going to be the motive, and that's what I want to talk about today first. The motive is just a short, distinct combination of those musical components that we talked about that create longer segments of music, such as phrases and periods, etc. Now, the key word there is distinct, right? The motive is something that's instantly recognizable, like this, or like this, or this, even this, and even this.
Every day I'm hustling.
So all of those you should recognize to some degree, even though I only played just a tiny bit of it. That would be the motive of those pieces. So variation and repetition of the motive creates unity throughout the piece of music from that one instantly recognizable unit. So it's through repetition and variation that composers and songwriters use the motive to create songs and pieces and even symphonies. So I'd like to go through these motivic alterations so that when you see them in music, you can recognize them. They're often employed in combinations to create something that sounds almost exactly like the motive that you heard previously, or to create something very different than what you initially heard at the beginning of the song or piece that you're listening to. Transposition is probably the most common of these, and you'll definitely see this in this class. If I play this, if this is my original motive, okay, and then I play I've just transposed that motive. These can be real or tonal, meaning the intervals in that motive can be precisely transposed, or they can be transposed just within the key. If I were to play that would be a tonal transposition because I kept that transposition within the key of C. Another very common motivic alteration is the inversion. One common example that I like to give is from a Bach convention. The motive sounds like this. Later on in the piece, you hear this. Which is just the motive, but just inverted. All of its intervals were the opposite direction. The next motivic alteration would be an interval change. And that's just where one interval in the motive is changed. So a good example would be this idea, and you'll recognize this one. If you're in my ear training class, you know what that first interval is. But let's say on a second verse, I wanted to make this a little bit more edgy, and I change that first interval. So it still sounds like Somewhere Over the Rainbow, but I changed that octave to a minor ninth. Augmentation and diminution are kind of two sides of the same coin. The augmentation increases note values. For instance, if you augment a quarter note, you would get, say, a half note. Likewise, with the diminution, that same quarter note would now be an eighth note. Here's a pretty good example from Bach. Let's take a listen. There's another way we can change the rhythm of a motive, and that's just with a rhythm change, believe it or not. We don't have to do an augmentation or a diminution. We can just change some other part of the rhythm of the motive, but keep the pitches intact, keep the intervals of that motive intact. Another motivic alteration is just a simple ornamentation. If this is my motive, a ornamentation of that motive would be. So the motive is maintained, but I'm just ornamenting it. Very simple. Fragmentation is just taking a fragment of the motive and using it elsewhere. Oftentimes, part of a motive might be useful for some kind of modulation, or it might be useful for rhythmic development. And so a composer will just use that one fragment of the motive. And then finally, we have an extension and truncation. An extension of the motive is simply just extending the motive by a few notes. Truncation of the motive is shortening it. Fairly straightforward. It's good to keep in mind with these motivic alterations that sometimes you'll hear only one, sometimes you'll hear two, sometimes you'll hear many. It just depends how much the motive has changed. And so the motive can change up until the point that you no longer recognize it, and then it maybe perhaps becomes a new idea. Also remember that a piece can have a single motive, or it can have many. Usually, shorter pieces have fewer motives, and longer pieces have more motives, as you'd expect. A motive's significance is in its repetition and development. And that's very important. We'll take a look at a piece a little bit later, and we'll talk about how its development and its repetition contribute to a motive's significance. Basically, the more you hear something, the more important it becomes. Motivic ideas can be transformed and developed in a lot of different ways, and that's kind of what makes music really interesting, is that you can have some abstract idea like a motive change and still be recognizable. Now, another short structural unit is the figure, but the figure is kind of secondary to a motive. It's usually less distinct. What makes the motive kind of a centerpiece of a piece of music is its distinctiveness, is that hook, that catch. The figure is more often seen in accompaniments or transitions of some kind. They're more general. You're more likely to see them in many, many different pieces than in a single piece. They tend to be repeated less than motives, although it depends on the piece. But they are less structurally significant than motives. An Alberti bass is a kind of figuration. Cadenzas would be a kind of figuration. Well, depending on the cadenza, I guess. Just because a figure is less structurally important than a motive doesn't mean that it can't be developed. One of my favorite examples is from Chopin Nocturne in C minor. Here we see the first iteration of this accompaniment figure. We'll take a listen. Okay, so now here's that same accompaniment when the original motive returns. Okay, and so you heard that figuration went from a very rhythmically simple quarter note figuration to one with very active triplet eighths, but it's still recognizable as that same figuration, along with the motive above it. So motives and figures are really, really short. The phrase is the next largest structural unit. Your Barry textbook describes this as completeness without finality, meaning you can have a phrase, but again, it won't be final, or won't sound final to our ear anyway. Um, and the phrase is just a motive with connective material. Now, this connective material tends to be more transient. A lot of scalar motion or arpeggiations, but not as distinct as you might hear in a motivic idea. And so, like we talked about last week, phrases usually have cadences, even if they're rhythmic cadences. The length of phrases can vary greatly. Um, Many phrases in common practice pieces are 2, 4, or 8 bars long, but some can be irregular. They can be 3, 5, or 7 bars. So keep an eye out for those. Don't always just count 2 bars or 4 bars and look for a cadence. Sometimes you might have a phrase extension in there. You do want to watch out for repeating phrases. How often and in what way they repeat is very, very important to identifying structures in music. It's important to note that small changes in the melody are slightly less important than harmonic changes. Now, before we go any further, I want to take a look at an example. This is a Haydn Minuet. Let's take a listen. Okay, so I'm going to leave the music up for a moment. Right away at the beginning of this piece, it becomes very clear what our motive is. Right there in measure 1, this idea here, that's our motive, that quarter triplet idea there, especially the triplet. Now, how do we know this is the motive? Well, if we look over in bar 5, we hear a repetition of that motive. It has different connective material there. When we talk about connective material, that's just kind of these quarter notes here in measure 6 and 7. Now, they serve more of a harmonic purpose, in this case leading us to a half cadence. So in measure 9, 10, 11, 12, you can kind of see that he develops this triplet idea before he makes his way back in measure 13 to the main motive again. He kind of returns. Now it's interesting to note in measure 13, notice what's happened to the motive. It's been truncated, right? We're missing that initial D. Now that D is still there, it's just down in the left hand. We still pick it up though, as listeners. But after measure 16, he really uses this triplet idea to bring the piece to a close. And so this just goes to show, when a motive is repeated, it becomes important to the piece, even if the piece is a minuet. So now that we're talking about phrases, it would be helpful to talk about phrase diagrams. And this is on page 369 in your Clendenning. These are helpful for just laying out the structure of the phrase, showing how multiple phrases interact. You'll also need to write these out for your quizzes and tests, so it's important to know this stuff. So it's very simple. Above the phrase line, you see up here somewhere, you'll you want to write a descriptor like an A or B or an A prime, B prime. This can be A, B, C, D, E. Just something to describe one particular phrase from a different phrase, because we're going to be talking about multiple phrases interacting. Below the phrase line, you want to write the number of measures. This tells us if it's, irregular or regular, just the number of measures. And often the measure numbers that begin and end that phrase. At the right and below the phrase, so see up here, you'll want to write the cadence that concluded that phrase, since cadences are so important to phrases. And then at the beginning and kind of below, generally the key is written there. But keep in mind the key can change during a phrase, so if the key does change, you'll want to note that as well.